Hello, my name is Erica Hageman, and I'm the Coordinator, Client Services at the Population Health Research Network. Today I will be presenting on accessing cross-jurisdictional linked data. In this presentation, I will focus on how to access cross-jurisdictional linked data for research purposes. For an introduction of what data linkage is, or if you'd like to learn more about designing and planning a linkage study, then take a look at the first two presentations in this series, available through the Population Health Research Network website and on the PHRN YouTube channel. I will commence by defining what we mean by cross-jurisdictional versus multi-jurisdictional data linkage. I will review the PHRN Data Linkage Services and Facilities that support the application and approval process, in addition to access to the linked data. I will introduce the PHRN online application system and then outline the steps involved in the application and approval process for accessing cross-jurisdictional linked data. Finally, I will touch on the costs and timeframes that may be expected to access cross-jurisdictional linked data for research and some of the factors that impact this. So Australia is a federation with a complex health system, and there is no single national data collection. In Australia, federal, state and territory governments hold different health and health-related administrative data. We recognise 9 jurisdictions that hold health and health-related data, including the 6 separate states: Western Australia, South Australia, Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria and Tasmania, 2 self-governing territories, Northern Territory and ACT, and we also recognise the Commonwealth as a jurisdiction. So what do we mean by cross-jurisdictional data linkage, and how does this differ from multi-jurisdictional data linkage? Well, multi-jurisdictional data linkage refers to the pooling of linked administrative data from more than one state or territory, for example, Western Australia, New South Wales and Queensland. And the data may be linked within, but not between each jurisdiction. In multi-jurisdictional research, the researcher is not able to take into account people or persons who may have records in multiple jurisdictions. I'll give an example. If a researcher undertakes multi-jurisdictional data linkage to study the 20-year survival rate of individuals diagnosed with a particular cancer in a number of Australian states or territories, the researcher could receive linked data or linked death records of, say, WA residents diagnosed with cancer if they subsequently died in WA. And similarly, the researcher could receive linked death records of a New South Wales resident or residents diagnosed with cancer if they subsequently died in New South Wales, and so on. However, the researcher would not be able to tell whether residents diagnosed with cancer in New South Wales subsequently died in Western Australia or another state or territory. And the same would apply to each jurisdiction in the multi-jurisdictional research project. So what cross-jurisdictional data linkage allows is for the researcher to be able to track cross-border flow between jurisdictions. And this is important because Australia's population is mobile and there's significant cross-border flow. So cross-jurisdictional data linkage refers to the linking of administrative data from 2 or more states or territories or any jurisdiction with the Commonwealth. And the researcher wishes to take into account individuals who have records in multiple jurisdictions. So in relation to the example of a researcher studying the 20-year survival rate of individuals diagnosed with a particular cancer in a number of Australian states, the researcher could receive linked death records of WA and New South Wales residents diagnosed with cancer, even if they subsequently died in a different jurisdiction to the one they were originally diagnosed in. So the researcher could receive information about individuals diagnosed in WA who later died in New South Wales, for example, and so on. And for near complete coverage, if the researcher wanted to know whether their cohort of interest had died anywhere in Australia, that is in any jurisdiction, regardless of which jurisdiction they were originally first diagnosed in, the researcher could apply for to the Commonwealth to link the cohort to the National Death Index. So why undertake cross-jurisdictional data linkage? So as I just mentioned, it allows the researcher to be able to assess cross-border usage of services. And this is important because the Australian population is mobile and there's significant cross-border flow. But why else would you undertake cross-jurisdictional data linkage? Well, by undertaking cross-jurisdictional data linkage, you're able to increase the statistical power of your study, and large numbers are needed for some research, particularly important for research on rare conditions or outcomes where data from more than one state or territory may be necessary to receive or to achieve the required sample size. It's also important because there's no single national data collection, and it may be that one jurisdiction does not collect all the data required to answer the research question. Another example of where cross-jurisdictional data linkage is of benefit is to obtain accurate data, essential for some longitudinal and national studies. The Population Health Research Network, or PHRN, is a coordinated, national, federated infrastructure which enables data to be linked at both the jurisdictional and cross-jurisdictional levels. The PHRN is coordinated by the National Coordinating or Program Office, located in Perth, Western Australia, at the University of Western Australia. But the PHRN comprises a network of project participants and data linkage units located in each Australian state or territory, within government or academic institutions, in addition to a national data linkage unit. So the National or Commonwealth Data Linkage Unit is within the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare. The Centre for Victorian Data Linkage, or CVDL, is based in the Victorian Agency of Health Information in the Department of Health. The Tasmanian Data Linkage Unit is operated by the Menzies Institute for Medical Research, and that's under an arrangement between the Department of Health Tasmania and the University of Tasmania. Data Linkage Queensland is located within the Statistical Services branch at the Queensland Department of Health. The Centre for Health Record Linkage, which is also known as CHERL, is managed by the New South Wales Ministry of Health, and that serves both New South Wales and the Australian Capital Territory. SANT DataLink is a collaborative joint venture between and including the South Australian and Northern Territory governments, the South Australian Health and Medical Research Institute, the University of South Australia, Flinders University, University of Adelaide, Menzies School of Health Research and Cancer Council, South Australia. And the SANT DataLink serves both South Australia and the Northern Territory. There is also SURE, or the Secured Unified Research Environment, and this is a purpose-built, online, remote access data research laboratory, which is operated by the Sachs Institute in New South Wales, and that is supported by the PHRN. So who can use the PHRN online application system? Researchers who are interested in applying for access to linked data for cross-jurisdictional or multi-jurisdictional research projects should apply via the PHRN online application system. Any person who wants to use the PHRN OAS must be a registered user of the online application system. The project owner is the person who creates the project in the online application system, and the project owner is the only person from the research team who can edit the online form. Research team members, who are also registered users, can access the OAS, including, for example, the principal investigator, data analysts, collaborators, students. Research team members can view the online form and add comments if they have been granted access by the project owner. Client services officers from the jurisdictional data linkage units who are registered users use the PHRN online application system to review submitted quotes, EOIs and applications. They also upload cost estimates, comments, provide feedback and manage approvals and agreements within this system. The Coordinator Client Services from the PHRN Program Office has administrative rights and, along with contract technical support, maintains the OAS system settings, the users, the reference data and help information. The Coordinator Client Services also, importantly, monitors the submissions to the online application system and coordinates the review and progress of the submissions from quotes through to approved applications. What are the benefits of using the online application system? For the researcher, they are able to submit an application to multiple jurisdictions simultaneously. They use the one form to obtain approval from multiple jurisdictions. They're able to use the system to view approvals as they come in from data custodians and data linkage units. They can manage all the relevant documents in this central location, and they're also able to share the application between members of their research team. For the jurisdictional data linkage units, they will receive the submitted forms at the same time. It has the benefit of encouraging a coordinated application and approval process. They can use the online application system to liaise with data custodians and the researcher. Like the researcher, it's a central location to manage relevant documents. And it also encourages participation in project planning and review meetings and to monitor progress of projects at monthly meetings with the PHRN Coordinator Client Services. So how to use the PHRN OAS? Once you are a registered user of the OAS, on the home page, you can click Create to start a new project. You'll be directed to a Summary tab or page, and here you should select the application type, whether that is a quote or an expression of interest or an EOI from the drop-down box. You will then be required to complete mandatory fields within each of the tabs or pages as listed on this slide. Once you have completed all the mandatory fields and all of the tabs and pages, you click Validate to submit your quote or expression of interest. There are a few things that I thought I would note here when completing the content of the quote or EOI to create a strong application. So even before you start completing your application, Invest time in planning and thinking about a sound study design. Also think about your secure data storage protocols. You may like to reach out to the PHRN Coordinator Client Services and/or relevant jurisdictional data linkage units if you need to clarify anything. In the form, make sure you use plain language because those reviewing your application may not be experts in your field of research. Use plain and simple language to accurately communicate your study goals, research questions, design, and management plans. Be as specific as possible, especially when requesting data. Be specific and only request the data that you need to answer your research questions. Ensure consistency across and within your application. So within the OAS form, but also across your other documents that you may need to complete and submit as part of your application approval process. You'll need to have secure data storage, access and use arrangements and document these within your application. So the PHRN, Coordinator Client Services, and the relevant jurisdictional data linkage units are here to help. So as well as engaging with them early, engage with them often because they can guide you through the application and data linkage process, and they'll also have questions of their own as your project progresses. So it's important to maintain regular contact. Once you have submitted in the PHRN online application system, the client services officers, coordinators and jurisdictional linkage units involved with the project will review the quote or EOI submission, and they will discuss the feasibility of the project in a project review meeting coordinated by the PHRN Coordinator Client Services. Following this, coordinated feedback will be provided to the researcher via email and also uploaded as a document to the PHRN OAS. The feedback may include relevant information about the data collections and availability, the linkage methodology, and further approval requirements. The client services officers and jurisdictional linkage units may also request further clarification of the cohort identification of privacy and data security measures as examples. Cost estimates will also be uploaded to the PHRN online application system and/or emailed to the principal investigator and project owner. So next is the researcher review phase, and this phase generally involves the researcher responding to any suggested changes or clarifications requested by the client services officers and jurisdictional data linkage units. This usually requires the researcher and the project owner specifically making amendments to the form in the OAS. But it may also involve further discussions between the researchers and individual data linkage units and completing additional jurisdictional specific forms. Upon completion of this phase, the application owner will press submit to return the application to the jurisdictional data linkage units. And please be aware that during this time, the expression of interest or quote may go back and forth between the researcher and the jurisdictional linkage units until the client or service officers are satisfied that the submission is complete. So once the expression of interest or the design phase of your project is complete, you will be notified that the EOI phase is complete. In the PHRN OAS, the status of your project will change to EOI completed. On the PHRN OAS homepage, press Edit and your application type will be automatically changed to Application. You then make any required changes and press Submit to lodge your application. After review by the Client Services team, the application will be submitted for approval by each relevant data custodian. And this is a legislative requirement for most administrative data collections. On behalf of the researcher, the Client Services officers will in most cases liaise with the relevant data custodians for review of your application. At this stage, the data custodian will provide in-principle support or conditional approval, or conversely reject the application. And note that data custodians typically will not provide final approval until the project has received ethics approval. If a project is given in-principle support, researchers can receive a feasibility letter stating that the linkage is technically feasible and that the data linkage unit is able to link the requested data. Data custodian approval or conditional approval usually occurs before ethics review, but all projects will require ethics approval. In most jurisdictions, researchers are encouraged to apply for ethics approval after they have received conditional approval from each of the data custodians from which they are requesting data and the technical feasibility letter from the relevant data linkage units. The Client Services officers of the jurisdictional data linkage units involved with linking data for your project will be able to provide you with guidance on this. Please notify the data linkage units when you are submitting the Human Research Ethics Committee application or applications. In the PHRN OAS, in the Approvals Ethics section, the application owner or project owner is able to press Add Ethics Committee to add the relevant HRECs and Manage Documents to upload all HREC applications, approval letters, consent forms, participant information sheets, etc. Once your project has ethics approval, email the data linkage units and/or update details in the PHRN OAS. But please note that the data linkage units will only learn of your project's ethics approval through your advice. So again, I think going back to having that regular contact with the relevant data linkage jurisdictional units. In the online application system, researchers are able to monitor and track data custodian approvals. So the jurisdictional data linkage units will approve datasets in the PHRN OAS upon receipt of data custodian approval letters. Once the project has all its approvals in place, that is data custodian, ethics and any other approvals required, including governance, the project will be given final approval in the PHRN online application system. Once all approvals have been received, the linkage and extraction of data for your project can proceed. For the linkage and extraction of data for your cross-jurisdictional linked data project, the relevant jurisdictional data linkage units will extract linkage keys from the data collections for your project and the cohort or cohorts of interest. The data linkage units then send the project-specific linkage keys to the data custodians who extract the requested content data. The data is then securely transferred, for example, via suffix, to an agreed data access facility, such as SHORE. And this is where the data is checked, cleaned, and formatted prior to the researcher undertaking any data analyses. The linkage and data provided is tailored specifically for the needs of each research project. Therefore, standard costs and timeframes are not available. However, it should be noted that the following factors will impact on project timeframes and costs. So project complexity can significantly impact on data delivery timeframes and cost. And the following aspects of a project can increase the complexity and therefore impact of the delivery time. So if new linkages are required, the speed of the linkage depends very much on the size, time frame, quality and completeness of the dataset being linked, and also which DLU is performing the linkage and the resources available. Cohort selection specifications. So projects become more complex as the number of cohort sources increases. In addition, the type and complexity of selection criteria impacts on the time required. If a control group selection is required, this can significantly increase a project's overall complexity and extend delivery timelines. Control selection often requires a linkage officer and/or a data analyst to write or amend scripts to select a suitable set of comparison records that may need to be matched or randomly selected and may also span multiple data sets or sources. The number and type of data sets impacts delivery times and timelines and cost. So projects become more complex and time consuming with each additional data source requested. Service data may be extracted from individual data collections. So therefore, the more data sets involved, the more work required. And some data sets, for example, Commonwealth data sets, may have particular governance and security requirements in place, which will impact on complexity and timelines. The number of jurisdictions involved also affect the complexity of the project. The time it takes for researchers to respond to feedback and complete and submit required forms, not just within the online application system, but other forms such as ethics applications, can impact on timeframes. In regard to approvals, in Australia, as previously discussed, research projects using linked data must be approved by at least 3 groups: the data linkage units, the data custodians responsible for each data set, and 1 or more human research ethics committees. The process of obtaining approvals and the time involved will vary between data linkage units, data custodians, and the relevant HRECs. It's important to also be aware that the application and approvals process for linked data may be longer when accessing Commonwealth data. The complexity of linkage is a factor of importance. For example, the dataset may have limited identifiers or be a new dataset which requires more investigation of feasibility or meetings, etc. Linkage staff resources and units priorities at the time can impact timeframes. Because of all of these factors, this is why we really encourage regular contact between the researcher or research team, the PHRN as required, but specifically the relevant jurisdictional data linkage units. And of course, in addition to this, in regard to timeframes, once the linked data is delivered, then there's variable time required by research teams that needs to be allocated for data preparation, data cleaning, data analysis, and write-up by the research group. And this will be dependent on the experience of that research team in analysing linked data. So that's the end of this presentation about accessing cross-jurisdictional linked data for research purposes. Thank you for your time and attention. You may also like to go to the PHRN website for further information, or if you have specific queries, please don't hesitate to get in contact with us via either email or phone, as per the details on this slide. But we really look forward to working with you to facilitate your cross-jurisdictional linked data research project. Thank you.